So we take it for granted that campaigns in America will be privately funded, which obviously creates the potential for real problems. Because while the normal contribution from ordinary people to a politician is just the expression of good luck, a hope that the candidate does well, sometimes the contributor wants something more. Sometimes he wants something in exchange for his contribution, and sometimes when that happens, the politician obliges. This is illegal. It's a corrupt contribution, and it's corrupt because it involves a quid pro quo corruption, and this for that corruption. That sort of an exchange is a crime. And the Supreme Court has allowed the regulation of campaign contributions to avoid the potential for that kind of crime. Now, the solution the court upheld in the case of Buckley was simply to limit the size of contributions, so that if the contribution was small enough, it wouldn't be an offer for a bribe. Indeed, if it were offered as a bribe, it would sound more like a joke. Okay, now critically, when the court upheld limitations on contributions to campaigns, the people challenging that law said, hey, why isn't bribery law enough? Because a contribution in exchange for a government benefit is a bribe. But what the court said in Buckley was, Congress can regulate beyond bribery. Congress can regulate as a prophylactic to make sure the people can look at the system of funding campaigns and not believe that every politician somewhere is being bought. So the principle the court upheld was if there was a risk, and maybe only if there is a risk of quid pro quo corruption, then Congress may regulate. Okay, now let's think about a completely different case. Imagine a candidate, Joe, and imagine somebody who wants to support the candidate, Joe, but this time the speaker has no connection or coordination with the politician. His speech is independent of the politician. In 1976, the Supreme Court said that such independent speech could not be regulated. And the reason was obvious, given the principle the court had articulated about quid pro quo corruption. Because the speech is independent, there could be no quid pro quo. And therefore, because there's no risk of quid pro quo corruption, there could be no justification for restricting that independent speech. Independent speech could spend in an unlimited way. Then in 2010, in Citizens United, the Supreme Court extended this reasoning to corporations and to unions. They too were now free to spend as much as they wanted in a political campaign, again, so long as they did not coordinate with the politician. No coordination meant no quid pro quo. No quid pro quo meant no power in Congress to limit that kind of speech. So the principle here is if there is no risk of quid pro quo corruption, then Congress cannot regulate. Okay, so here's where the cool stuff starts. Let's go back to this picture of independent speech by individuals, corporations, or unions, and let's just add one more player to the board, a PAC, a political action committee. And imagine this PAC is an independent PAC, meaning it doesn't coordinate its speech with the candidate either. The principle of Citizens United would suggest that just as with a rich person or a corporation or a union, this PAC too would be allowed to spend as much money as it wants so long as it does not coordinate its spending with the candidate. Okay, now think about how this PAC raises its money. In the ordinary case, we might imagine a rich person showing up to the PAC and offering some kind of quid pro quo. They could say, I'll give you $1 million, PAC, if you agree to run ads about the widget bill. And imagine the PAC says, okay. And so there is this deal where the money is given to the PAC in exchange for the PAC saying what the independent rich person wants them to say. This is totally okay under the law of campaign finance because there is no coordination with the politician. The quid pro quo between the PAC and the rich person is not illegal The only potential illegality is if there's coordination between the rich person or the PAC and the politician. And that was the principle that upheld in Speech Now, the case decided 3 months after Citizens United, the holding that contributions to independent political action committees cannot be regulated either. The DC Circuit held that so long as the PAC is independent, the contribution to the PAC cannot involve corruption. Now, the Supreme Court has never held this, but this is the picture you see right here, that led the DC Circuit to conclude that there could be no quid pro quo corruption without contributions to an independent political action committee. And after the king of the circuits had spoken, all of the other circuits, or practically all, just followed along. Every single court to consider the matter, to the great embarrassment of American constitutional law, has held that contributions to independent political action committees cannot be regulated because contributions to independent political action committees could not risk quid pro quo corruption. Okay. But the DC Circuit and these minions are just flat out wrong. And obviously so. Here's why. Okay, let's modify the hypothetical just slightly. Let's imagine moving the rich person over next to the candidate. And imagine the rich person saying to the candidate, hey, Senator, I'll contribute $1 million to your super PAC if you'll do something in favor of the widget bill. And imagine the candidate, God forbid, saying, okay. That deal, in exchange for favors involving a contribution to a super PAC, is plainly quid pro quo corruption. It's quid pro quo corruption because between the candidate and the donor, there is a deal, even though the deal involves simply giving money to the PAC. And that deal, therefore, means there could be quid pro quo corruption, even though it's just a donation to a super PAC. Now, you might say, could this really happen? But the answer is that this is exactly the pattern alleged, though not proven, against New Jersey Senator Robert Menendez, that he agreed to give favors to the donor in exchange for the donor contributing to a super PAC that supported Robert Menendez. So the point is, this is quid pro quo corruption through a contribution to a super PAC. What the DC Circuit had said was impossible is plainly possible. And it creates, therefore, the possible risk of quid pro quo corruption, which, if the principle from Buckley is true, means Congress should have the power to regulate such contributions. Now you say, it's possible, but is it really likely? But remember, Buckley didn't ask how likely it was that a contribution to a candidate was part of a quid pro quo bribe. Buckley just asked, was there a risk? And there was a risk. And that created the power in Congress to regulate against that risk. But you still might say, okay, but how often is a gift to a super PAC the product of quid pro quo corruption? And when you realize that super PACs receive contributions in the millions, one was over $1 billion, you could say, it's certainly more likely that a contribution to a super PAC is going to involve this type of illegal corruption than a contribution of $3,000 to a candidate, which is an amount that Congress has the power to regulate because the court has upheld the power to limit direct contributions because of this risk. Yet the courts have said that the $3,000 contribution to the candidate can be limited, but the $1 billion contribution to the super PAC cannot. This is just crazy talk. It's madness. If the one can be regulated, then both should be able to be regulated. And if the remedy with respect to contributions to a candidate is to shrink the size of the contribution, that should be the same with contributions to a super PAC. So much should be obvious. Okay, here's what we've learned. The Supreme Court allows the regulation of contributions when they create a risk of quid pro quo corruption. Large contributions to candidates create that risk, the risk of quid pro quo corruption. So they can be regulated, the Supreme Court has said again and again and again. But large contributions to super PACs create that same risk, the risk of quid pro quo corruption. And so they obviously should be able to be regulated too. And so the king of the circuits is just wrong, and the minions need to find a new leader. Okay, that's the argument that points to the error at the core of the case that created super PACs. Help us to see the error in a way that everybody understands, even those not willing to listen to a clumsy 10-minute plus video by a law professor. Thanks very much.